She's just the assistant. Why is she touching the piano? Those were the words that humiliated Liana Cortés, once a legendary pianist, now working in silence as an overlooked staff member. But when the star student collapses moments before a high-stakes performance, they throw her on stage as a desperate replacement. They thought they were mocking her, but the moment her fingers touched the keys, the entire hall froze. Because the simple woman they dismissed? She was about to deliver the most unforgettable performance of their lives and expose the truth they'd buried for years. This is the breathtaking story of injustice, rediscovery, and poetic justice that no one saw coming. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. She's just the assistant. Why is she touching the sheet music? The questions slice through the quiet corridor like a discordant note, sharp enough to make Naomi Reed pause mid-motion. Her hand hovered inches above a worn stack of scores, list transcriptions layered with penciled notes, red markings, and the unmistakable residue of arrogance. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The voice belonged to Professor Harold Bates, senior composition instructor, former prodigy, and full-time gatekeeper of tradition. He loomed at the threshold of Studio 3, clutching his favorite coffee mug and wearing the same impatient scowl he reserved for late assignments and unconventional opinions. Naomi gently drew her hand back and lowered her gaze. "Just organizing, sir. Dr. Crane asked me to file by composer." "By composer?" he muttered with a bitter chuckle. "Crane asked for chronological. No wonder our events have been a mess lately." Before she could correct him, he was already disappearing around the corner, muttering about declining standards and the dangers of hiring civilians to work in a music institution. Naomi said nothing. She never did. For 6 weeks, Naomi Reed had lived like a shadow within the stone walls of Langston Academy for the Arts, a place so dripping in prestige that even its practice rooms had waiting lists. Students wore concert black like armor, and faculty floated on clouds of critical acclaim. Yet Naomi, in her navy cardigan and gray flats, remained unseen. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Because the last time Naomi Reed was seen, truly seen, the cost had been nearly unbearable. The Langston Conservatory was a cathedral of music, where arched windows spilled sunlight over grand pianos and every hallway echoed with ambition. Naomi's days passed in a rhythm of silence, dusting keys, arranging recital programs, reordering shelves of orchestral parts. She moved like a careful melody between offices and rehearsal halls, and when spoken to, responded in a gentle mezzo-soprano that didn't rise above what was necessary. She didn't complain when asked to run errands that weren't hers. She didn't flinch when students dismissed her with the flippant cruelty of the young and gifted. And when Dr. Evelyn Crane, Langston's revered, icy head of piano studies, handed her a thick folder of disorganized music with a cold, "Make this legible, Miss Reed," Naomi nodded without hesitation and tucked the folder under her arm like a burden she was born to carry. Only one person occasionally looked at her like she might be more than a pair of invisible hands. Madame Sabine Moreau, the conservatory's oldest and most feared voice. Naomi suspected it wasn't kindness. It was instinct. That afternoon, Naomi was in the print room, the scent of warm ink and powdered toner rising around her like fog, when she heard the announcement echo over the hallway speakers. "All staff, please note, tomorrow's scholarship competition will begin promptly at 10 a.m. Final programs must be submitted by 4 today." She glanced at the clock. 2:17 p.m. She had exactly 103 minutes to finalize the document that would define which young pianist would receive the conservatory's most coveted full-ride scholarship, the Carmichael Award, funded by a donor so powerful his last name was carved in stone near the main auditorium. Naomi moved quickly, flipping through notes scribbled in 3 languages. Red pen corrections bled through the pages, Madame Moreau's trademarks, while unfamiliar composer names tangled with Cyrillic markings and abbreviations only the elite would pretend to understand. She sighed softly and began typing. "Miss Reed," barked a clipped voice from the doorway. It was Dr. Crane, wearing her signature charcoal suit and hair coiled in a no-nonsense bun. Her heels tapped in double time. These program notes still list Julian Ford as performing Chopin's Etudes. That changed 3 days ago. He's performing Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth. Naomi's fingers paused. I'll fix that immediately. Crane narrowed her eyes. And spare us any opinion on the piece's difficulty this time. You're here to organize, not to interpret. I understand, but she did have an opinion. Julian Ford, Langston's golden student, was barely 17. Brilliant? Yes. But Liszt's adaptation of Beethoven's Fifth was a beast, a brutal storm of a piece demanding not only technical prowess but emotional maturity well beyond flashy fingerwork. Naomi knew because she had played it, not in practice, not in a classroom, on stage, in Berlin, in front of 2,000 people. But that had been 5 years ago, before the accident, before the silence, before she erased herself from the world she once ruled. Now she printed programs and swallowed memories. Later that evening, Naomi made her way to Madame Moreau's studio to deliver the updated materials. The door was slightly ajar, the sound of Bach's Partita No. 2 trickling through the crack like liquid gold. "Entree," came the command in a voice aged like burgundy wine. Naomi stepped in, holding out the printed pages. "The program, madam." Moreau took the pages with a curt nod but didn't look up. "Is this version correct, at last?" "Yes, madam, including Mr. Ford's change to the Liszt transcription." At that, Moreau raised her eyes. "You seem to have an unusual awareness of our repertoire for someone with no formal training." Naomi tilted her head. "Only what I hear in the halls." Moreau studied her with feline stillness. "Curious, most who pass through these halls absorb noise. You appear to absorb meaning." Naomi said nothing. Silence was still her armor. As she turned to leave, her eyes flicked briefly to the open piano in the corner, its lid resting halfway. On the stand sat a worn score, Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It was the same edition Naomi used during her European tour. Her hands twitched again. "Anything else, madam?" "No, but..." Moreau's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Tell me, Miss Reed, have you ever played?" Naomi froze. A dangerous question, a loaded one. She responded without flinching. "Just toyed with the keys now and then." Madame Moreau said nothing more, but her eyes lingered on Naomi's retreating figure for a long moment after the door closed. That night, Naomi stayed late. The conservatory had fallen into silence, just the faint hum of janitorial equipment and the occasional creak of the ancient floors. She wandered into Recital Hall B, empty, bathed in the pale glow of recessed lights and dust motes. There, gleaming in the half-darkness, sat the Steinway Model D. Naomi walked toward it like a pilgrim to altar. She didn't sit, she simply rested her hand on its lid, closed her eyes, felt the thrum of a past life like a ghost beneath her fingers. Then she turned, walked away, and disappeared once more into the quiet corridors of Langston Academy. No applause, no spotlight, just the sound of distant footsteps fading into the dark. "You speak as if you understand this music, Miss Reed." The accusation came mid-step, neither gentle nor cruel, but piercing. Professor Harold Bates stood in the doorway of the conservatory lounge, arms folded across his faded cardigan, the stench of lukewarm coffee clinging to him like habit. Naomi looked up from the score she had just straightened. She had allowed herself one indulgent moment, just one. The original program sheet for Julian Ford's performance had been left behind on the side table, annotated in red by Madame Moreau, revised by Dr. Crane, and nearly discarded altogether. Naomi had picked it up, not to study, but to save it from the trash heap. But as she read the marked phrases, the sharp crescendos, the unforgiving fingering, her mind had gone elsewhere. Back to Paris, back to Vienna, back to applause and breathless audiences and aching fingers wrapped in silk. Now Bates was watching her like she was trespassing. "I'm just familiar with the composer," she replied carefully. "Beethoven's themes are hard to forget," he chuckled darkly. "Liszt's version of Beethoven isn't for amateurs, it's for the ferocious. You'd have to be a monster at the keys to even attempt it." Naomi said nothing. That, too, was part of her training. Let people fill silence with their own assumptions. "Don't get me wrong," Bates continued, stepping closer. "You're efficient. I've never had a misplaced score since you arrived, but don't pretend you understand what lives in these pages. That's not your world." He left her standing there, his final words hanging in the air like a wrong note sustained too long. The morning of the Carmichael Scholarship Competition arrived like a conductor's downbeat, sudden, crisp, commanding. Langston Academy was buzzing. The auditorium shimmered with floral arrangements and velvet rope dividers. Donors in tailored suits milled about with wine glasses, and students flitted nervously behind the scenes, their hearts drumming faster than their metronomes ever would. Naomi wore her cleanest dress, navy blue with a belt too modest to be fashionable. Her hair was braided with care, as it always was when she needed to feel grounded. Today, she was asked to distribute the printed programs, each one bearing the logo of the Carmichael Foundation and the name of the school's most promising performer, Julian Ford. He was to open the competition with Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth. No pressure. Backstage, Naomi found the students pacing like caged birds. One was humming nervously to himself. Another muttered entire cadenzas under her breath, fingers twitching on an invisible keyboard. And in the corner, seated with a distant, glassy stare, was Julian. He looked nothing like the boy from the posters. His face was drawn, his posture hunched, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Naomi approached quietly. "Mr. Ford?" He didn't move. She knelt down slowly, making herself smaller than his panic. "Julian," she said gently, "can I see your score?" He looked up at her, eyes wide, dazed. She reached for it delicately. He didn't resist. Flipping to the second movement, she pointed to a particularly brutal transition. "This is where you always rush," she said quietly. He blinked. You were listening?" Naomi offered a faint smile. "It's hard not to, when the music is that passionate. I keep stumbling," he admitted, voice cracking. "The tempo, it slides away from me." She nodded. "Because you're thinking about your hands, not the shape of the sound. Play this like waves, not thunder. Flow over it." Julian stared at her as if she'd just cracked a code. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Naomi hesitated. "Just something I overheard Madame Moreau say once," she lied. Before he could ask more, a voice rang through the hallway like a cymbal crash. "Places, everyone. Julian, you're up first." Dr. Crane's heels struck the floor in sharp succession, clipboard in hand, her gaze sweeping across the anxious students. "And Miss Reed," she added without turning, "please keep the green room quiet. We don't need distractions." Naomi nodded and backed away, though Julian gave her one last glance of desperate gratitude before heading toward the curtain. She wished she could help more, but she had already said too much. From the side room, Naomi listened through the old brass speaker. Dr. Crane's voice rang out over the intercom. "Welcome to the Langston Academy's annual Carmichael Scholarship Competition." Polite applause followed, then silence, then music. Julian had begun. The opening chords came strong, confident. Naomi closed her eyes and listened, not to the notes, but to the spaces between them, the breath of the piece. The tension and release. He had taken her advice, he was flowing, not forcing. But as the second page arrived, she could hear the strain return. The crescendo flattened. The transitions became cautious. His fear began to seep through the keys. By the end, his performance was fine, technically adequate, but not transcendent. And at Langston Academy, fine was unforgivable. Minutes later, Naomi was carrying a tray of water glasses to the judge's table when she overheard them whispering. "Too controlled," said Dr. Crane. "Too tentative," muttered Professor Bates, sipping his coffee. "These children don't understand Liszt. It's fire, not formula." Naomi kept walking, quiet, unnoticed, but Professor Bates spotted her and smirked. "Ah, our favorite shadow," he said loudly enough to draw Crane's attention. "Tell me, Miss Reed, what did you think of Mr. Ford's performance?" Naomi froze mid-step. Crane narrowed her eyes. "Yes, Miss Reed, you seemed awfully invested backstage." It was meant to humiliate her. But Naomi had spent years learning how to respond to shame. With honesty. "I thought he played beautifully," she said slowly. "But he hasn't found the piece's heart yet. Liszt didn't just transcribe Beethoven, he reimagined him. That takes more than skill. It takes risk." The silence that followed could have split stone. Crane's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. Bates stared. Another judge raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry," Naomi stammered. "I shouldn't have spoken." "No, you shouldn't have," Crane snapped. "Return to your duties, Miss Reed. Leave the analysis to professionals." Naomi nodded and turned away. But she didn't see the way Madame Moreau, sitting in the second row, turned her head slightly, studying her like a familiar chord she couldn't quite place. Something had shifted. What do you mean he can't perform? Dr. Evelyn Crane's voice, usually wrapped in composure, now cracked like a dropped baton on stage. The green room, moments earlier a haven of whispered encouragement and nervous pacing, had turned into a pressure cooker. Students fell silent. Faculty circled, and in the middle of it all, sitting hunched on a velvet bench, his head between his knees, was Julian Ford. He was shaking. Not from nerves, from something far deeper. I can't feel my fingers, he gasped between breaths. They're numb, completely numb. Naomi Reed stood just a few feet away, frozen. She could hear his shallow gasps, like someone drowning on dry land. His skin had gone pale, his arms limp at his sides. It's a panic attack, Madame Sabine Moreau said grimly, kneeling beside him with surprising gentleness. His body is rebelling, his breath's too shallow, his hands are going into shutdown. Crane's expression twisted with frustration. Not now, not today. Julian, Moreau said calmly, breathe with me. 4 counts in, hold, and release. But his eyes remained wide and unfocused. Professor Bates pushed past a cluster of stunned students, his voice rising. We need a backup. Someone. Anyone. We can't delay again. Danson is in the front row. He flew in from New York for this performance. Julian was the only one assigned list, Madame Moreau snapped. This isn't a recital piece you can sight read, it's a war. Crane turned to the assistant stage manager. Find Michelson. Maybe he can fill the time with Chopin. He's already played, Dr. Crane, the assistant said softly, and Zhang's a violinist, not a pianist. We're about to lose $2 million in scholarship funding, Bates hissed. This foundation was promised Beethoven through Liszt. If we cancel, the Academy takes a financial hit we can't absorb. Naomi watched them all panic like cornered animals. Voices clashed, egos flared. But her eyes stayed on Julian. And then, without thinking, she moved. She walked forward, kneeling slowly beside him. Julian, look at me. His breathing hitched. Breathe in through your nose, 4 seconds, she whispered. Hold. Now breathe out, 8 seconds, slow and steady. She placed her hand on his shoulder, not firm, not forceful, just present. Gradually his shoulders began to relax, but the tremble in his hands remained. There's no way he can play, Madame Moreau said softly. Crane snapped her head toward Naomi. Miss Reed, fetch water. Cold. Quickly. Naomi didn't move. I can play, she said instead. Silence fell like a curtain. Dr. Crane blinked. Excuse me? Naomi rose to her feet. Her voice, though quiet, no longer wavered. I know the piece, the Liszt transcription. I can play it. Bates let out a sharp laugh. You, don't be absurd. I'm not being absurd, Professor. You're the administrative assistant, Crane said, as if reminding her of her own name. This is Beethoven through Liszt, performed before the entire Academy and its most powerful donors. I understand exactly what it is. Moreau studied her for a long moment. You said you had no formal training. I never said that, Naomi replied gently. You all just assumed. The room stayed quiet long enough for a single note to resonate. You're not seriously considering this, Crane said, turning to Moreau. What choice do we have? Moreau responded. The hall is full. The donors are watching. If she's wrong, it will be a disaster. But if we do nothing, we cancel, and Langston is publicly humiliated. Professor Bates threw up his hands. Have we lost our minds? Naomi stepped forward, calm as the eye of a storm. I don't need the sheet music. You. What? Crane barked. I don't need the sheet music, Naomi repeated. I know every measure, every phrase, every breath of that piece. Then prove it, Bates growled, thrusting the score into her hands. Show us something. Hum a single bar. Naomi took the music, closed her eyes, and whispered, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But it wasn't just the motif, it was the phrasing, the intensity, the subtle rise and fall of emotion in her tone, an understanding so intrinsic it stunned them into silence. Moreau broke it first. I think she's telling the truth. Dr. Crane hesitated. They could already hear murmurs rising from the main hall. The audience was growing restless. Intermission had gone too long. Crane turned to Naomi, voice low and cold. If you embarrass this institution, you will be terminated, immediately. Do you understand? Naomi met her gaze without blinking. I understand. Professor Bates shoved the music into her hands one more time. At least hold this while you pretend. Naomi smiled faintly. I won't need it, but thank you. In the wings, the stage manager counted down. 30 seconds. Dr. Crane turned, plastering on a gracious expression, and stepped into the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice echoed over the auditorium. Due to an unforeseen circumstance, our original performer, Mr. Julian Ford, will not be able to continue. However, we are honored to present a substitute performer, Miss Naomi Reed, who will now perform Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. In the audience, confusion rippled like a dropped pebble in a still lake. Naomi who? Wasn't she handing out programs? Crane stepped aside and Naomi emerged under the lights. She could feel the stares, the disbelief, the judgment. But she felt something else too, a warmth rising in her fingertips. Her hands had not touched a concert grand piano in 5 years, and now they trembled, not from fear but from awakening. She bowed slightly, sat, adjusted the bench with surgical precision, and then, in one breathless moment, she placed her hands on the keys, her fingers curled into familiar positions her body had never forgotten. She waited, not for applause, not for approval, but for the silence to thicken just enough. Then, she played. From the very first note, the room changed. Not just the sound, but the air itself, as if the oxygen had thickened with awe. Naomi Reed struck the opening chords of Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony with such authority, such clarity, that the audience collectively leaned forward. The piano didn't ring, it roared. But beneath the power there was something even more captivating: control. Not the rigid kind taught by fearful teachers, the kind that only comes from surviving something. Naomi's fingers moved like lightning, fluid, precise, devastating. She didn't read from the score. She didn't need to. She wasn't performing the piece. She was inhabiting it, interpreting it not with showmanship but with soul. Each note was a story, each crescendo a confession, each pause a reckoning. In the front row, Dr. Evelyn Crane sat frozen, her expression blank but her knuckles white against the arms of her chair. Beside her, Professor Harold Bates stared as if the laws of nature had just reversed. And on the opposite side, Madame Sabine Moreau leaned forward, breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. "She's not playing the piano," a voice whispered from the fourth row. "She's commanding it." The audience was no longer murmuring. They were hypnotized. Naomi's hands flowed across the keys, guiding the chaotic brilliance of Liszt's interpretation into something deeper, something only someone who had broken and rebuilt herself could create. This wasn't technical mastery, though she had that in spades. It was emotional transmutation. Years of pain channeled into every rising phrase, every cascading arpeggio an echo of memory, every tremolo a heartbeat refusing to fade. The middle section bloomed like light after a thunderstorm, tender, aching, triumphant. And in that fragile calm, one patron whispered, awestruck, to the person beside him, "That's not Naomi Reed." Moreau finally breathed the name aloud. "Liana Cortés." The whisper spread like wildfire. Liana Cortés, not Naomi. Liana, the prodigy who had vanished 5 years earlier after an on-stage collapse in Vienna. The one whose hands had been deemed ruined. The one who was never supposed to play again. The one who had disappeared without a word. Until now. Liana's, performance swelled toward its conclusion. The final movement, the most treacherous of all, soared through the hall like a battle hymn. Her fingers blurred with intensity, yet not a single note was missed. Her body moved not with struggle, but with purpose, like a bird returning to flight after forgetting what its wings were for. She could feel the audience breathing with her now. Not judging, not doubting, just witnessing. And when the final chords crashed into the hall with the weight of destiny, the room fell still. Frozen. 3 seconds of total silence, and then, like a tidal wave breaking, the standing ovation. People leapt to their feet. Applause thundered down like summer rain. Crane was still seated, stunned, blinking like someone surfacing from underwater. Bates had dropped his program onto the floor without noticing. And Madame Moreau? She was already standing, tears glistening, clapping with both hands over her heart. Naomi remained seated at the piano for a moment longer. Her hands resting on her lap, her eyes closed, but her soul awakened. She stood, bowed once, and the ovation roared louder. From backstage, Julian Ford peered out, his eyes wide, his panic attack forgotten, replaced by open-mouthed awe. Liana turned toward him and gave the smallest of smiles. He smiled back, grateful, humbled, changed. Then she faced the audience again, ready to bow a second time, when Dr. Crane stood abruptly. She approached the stage with robotic grace, took the mic, and faced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice wobbling despite her practiced tone. "I believe we owe you an explanation." She turned slowly toward Naomi. "Would you care to introduce yourself properly, Miss Reed? Or shall I say, Miss Cortés?" The audience gasped. Whispers swirled like wind in a canyon. Naomi stepped forward, calm as glass. "My name is Liana Cortés," she said simply, "and this is the first time I've played in public in 5 years." The crowd erupted again, this time not just with applause, but with awe. The whispers became shouts. "Liana Cortés, she was the one in Vienna. I thought she quit forever. She's even better than before." From the back of the hall, a silver-haired man stood. "Miss Cortés," he called, loud and clear. "I'm Robert Danson. My foundation came to fund the future of classical music, but today, we witnessed its resurrection." He smiled, eyes crinkling with admiration. "Would you honor us by leading a master class for our scholars?" Before Liana could speak, Dr. Crane jumped in, her voice suddenly enthusiastic. Her earlier disdain vanished like mist. "The Langston Academy would be thrilled to host Miss Cortés as a permanent artist in residence," she said, her words fast and overeager. "In fact, we've long discussed the idea of expanding our leadership to include someone of her caliber." Liana raised a brow, but said nothing about the lie. The audience laughed softly, sensing the shift. At the edge of the stage, Professor Bates awkwardly cleared his throat and stepped forward. "I must apologize, Miss Cortés," he said, his tone humble for the first time. "I failed to see." "You didn't look," she said gently. "That's different." And then she turned. Julian was waiting. "I've never heard anything like that," he said in a whisper, eyes shining. "You will," she replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "With the right teacher." "Will you be mine?" she smiled. "I'd be honored, but promise me one thing." "Anything." "Play for the music," she said, "not for the approval." He nodded, overwhelmed. And in that moment, as the professors fumbled over themselves to claim her, as the audience buzzed with disbelief and delight, Liana Cortés saw not a return to the spotlight, but the beginning of something far better. A future of teaching, of healing, of showing others the music within themselves. 1 month later, the nameplate on the studio door read, "Liana Cortés, Artist in Residence, Langston Academy for the Arts." The door was mahogany, the lettering gold. But Liana didn't care about that. She sat by the tall window, sunlight warming the side of her face, a steaming cup of mint tea beside a stack of audition tapes and scholarship applications. For the first time in years, she felt something most artists spend a lifetime chasing. Belonging. The morning had already been surreal. Dr. Crane now addressed her with a formality bordering on reverence. Every departmental meeting began with, "What does Miss Cortés think?" Professor Bates, once a brick wall of arrogance, now knocked on her door before speaking and never made eye contact for more than 2 seconds. And yet, only Madame Moreau had stayed exactly the same. "You've always been Liana," she had said with a shrug after the concert. "You simply let us believe otherwise." Liana's thoughts were interrupted by a knock. She glanced at the clock. "Right on time. Come in." Julian Ford entered, sheet music in hand, a cautious excitement lighting up his face. "Good morning, Professor Cortés," he said with a smile. She returned it. "Let's hear it." Julian crossed the room to the baby grand in the corner. His shoulders were looser now, his fingers steadier. He sat, breathed, and began to play the Liszt section that had once paralyzed him. This time, the notes flowed like water. When he finished, he looked up. "Well?" he asked, wide-eyed. Liana tilted her head. "Better. You're not fighting it anymore, you're speaking through it." He beamed. She continued, voice thoughtful. "But don't become obsessed with perfection. Music isn't about hitting every mark. It's about telling the truth even if your hands tremble while doing it." He nodded slowly, and then, more quietly, "Do you ever regret hiding who you were?" Liana turned to the window. That the view overlooked the practice garden where a young cellist played in the early light. "No," she said. "I regret that I had to." After Julian left, Liana lingered in her studio. She thought about everything that had changed in just 30 days. The letters from her former peers had started pouring in. "Where have you been? Can we book you? Are you performing again?" But she wasn't interested in the stage anymore. She was interested in this room, in students like Julian, in undoing the kind of blindness that had once defined this institution. That afternoon, she was invited to address the new scholarship finalists. The recital hall was packed. Faculty, donors, hopeful students. Robert Danson sat near the front, his cane resting beside his chair. Madame Moreau gave her an encouraging nod as she stepped on stage. Liana stood before the audience with calm ease. "I'm not here to speak about technique," she began. "You have teachers for that. I'm here to speak about vision, not what you see in the mirror, or on a resume, or even across a keyboard, but what you see in others." She paused. "When I came here as an assistant, people assumed I didn't belong, that I couldn't possibly know what I was touching, hearing, organizing. They saw my plain clothes, my title, and that was enough for them to dismiss me." She scanned the audience. Some looked uncomfortable. "We often see only what we expect to see," she continued, "and in doing so, we miss the extraordinary." She stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Talent doesn't wear a name tag. Genius doesn't announce itself in the hallway, and power, true power, often enters the room quietly." A hush fell over the audience. Julian watched from the wings, nodding with understanding. "If I had walked in here wearing a designer gown and a concert reputation, you would have welcomed me as a prodigy. But instead I walked in as a simple woman, and that was all it took to make me invisible." She smiled, not with bitterness, but with grace. "I am not invisible anymore." As she stepped down from the stage, the audience stood again, not out of obligation, but from something deeper. Respect, recognition, and perhaps for the first time, reflection. Outside the recital hall, a young violinist approached her. "I saw the concert video," she said breathlessly. "I've watched it 10 times. Liana smiled. "Then it's time to put the screen down and pick your bow up." The girl laughed. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you tell them who you were sooner?" Liana looked at her, and then she answered the same way she had answered Madame Moreau. "Would they have treated me the same if they knew?" Back in her office, Liana pinned a note to her wall. It was from a student she hadn't met yet. One of many who now wrote to her daily. It read, "I used to think I wasn't good enough because no one noticed me, but now I think maybe they just weren't listening." Liana closed her eyes. Sometimes music is about being heard. Sometimes it's about listening. And sometimes it's about having the courage to play, even when the world isn't ready to recognize the sound. "You're telling me she rewrote the curriculum?" Dr. Evelyn Crane's voice, always clipped and composed, now cracked with barely contained disbelief. "She adjusted it," Madame Sabine Moreau corrected, not bothering to look up from her espresso. "She found 6 pieces misattributed in your romantic syllabus and added 3 that had been neglected since the 1980s. Seems your version of history was a bit selective." They were seated in the faculty lounge, a place once reserved for polite academic snobbery and backhanded compliments. But now it buzzed with quiet panic. Because Liana Cortés wasn't just back, she was changing everything. It had been 3 weeks since the performance that flipped the Langston Academy on its head. In that time, subtle but seismic shifts began to ripple through its marble halls. Students once overlooked were now heard. Applications for her masterclass had tripled. Faculty, long used to unchallenged control, now found their comments weighed against a new voice. A voice that carried both authority and audience. Dr. Crane, who had once reduced Naomi Reed to nothing more than the help, now found herself cornered by polite correction at every turn. When she suggested simplifying the winter repertoire for the incoming class, Liana responded, "If they're being trained for excellence, we don't lower the music, we raise the mentoring." Crane smiled through gritted teeth. "Of course." Professor Harold Bates, meanwhile, was unraveling in quieter ways. It wasn't just his lectures that were now under review. It was his memory. He found himself replaying every moment he'd dismissed her. Every time he rolled his eyes when she offered to help carry manuscripts. Every time he chuckled at her pronunciation of Liszt. Now, the students quoted her. One sophomore piano major said it plainly during a workshop. "Professor Cortés taught me how to listen. You taught me how not to get yelled at." Bates nodded tightly and excused himself. But Liana wasn't chasing revenge. She barely acknowledged the shift. She simply did the work. She met with students daily, redesigned the Academy's new mentorship initiative, and launched a First Voices recital series dedicated entirely to students who had never before been featured at Langston. In private, however, even she had to admit, it was strange being on the inside again, stranger still to be admired. The very halls where she once walked invisible now echoed with whispers of her name spoken like legend. One day, while reviewing recital schedules, she overheard two junior instructors whispering, "Do you think she'll stay here forever?" "I don't know, but she's making us rewrite everything we thought we knew." Later that afternoon, Madame Moreau knocked softly on her office door and stepped inside. "Your name has returned to the European registry," she said, placing a cream envelope on her desk. "And Vienna is calling." Liana's breath hitched. She knew what the envelope meant before she even opened it. Inside, embossed in gold ink, was a formal invitation. "To Liana Cortés, we welcome you back to the Vienna Grand Hall as guest performer and juror of the International Virtuoso competition. 5 years since your final performance, we are ready, if you are." She stared at it for a long moment. Madame Moreau watched quietly, then added, almost casually, "You don't have to go back for them." Liana looked up. "Then why should I?" Madame Moreau smiled. "You go back for her. The version of you who left that stage in silence." Outside, the autumn leaves drifted like the soft final notes of a nocturne. And inside Langston Academy, a reckoning continued. Not with violence or vengeance, but with grace, truth, and a woman reclaiming her rightful place not by forcing change, but by becoming it. The cold marble of Vienna's Grand Hall hadn't changed. The same gilded archways, the same crimson velvet seats, the same impossible silence before a performance. But Liana Cortés had. She stood at the edge of the rehearsal floor, eyes tracing the curves of the concert stage. A stage she had once fled, broken, humiliated, forgotten. It was here, 5 years ago, that her hands betrayed her. It was here that tremors had robbed her of Liszt, of Chopin, of everything. The critics hadn't just reported on the collapse, they devoured it. Cortés crumbles in Vienna, the fall of a prodigy. Now, they wanted her back. Her phone vibrated. A message from Julian Ford lit up the screen. "Remember what you told me. Play for the music, not the crowd." She smiled. He was the reason she said yes. The invitation hadn't only asked her to perform, it had offered her a seat on the jury panel for the International Virtuoso competition, a place of judgment, influence, and visibility. But she had accepted on one condition. She would bring 2 Langston students with her, Julian and a young violinist named Sora Mai. And they would perform on that same stage where she had once fallen. Later that evening, during rehearsal, Julian approached her behind the curtain. His suit was crisp, but his hands fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve. "You don't seem nervous," he said. Liana gave a soft laugh. "Oh, I am, but I've learned not to give nerves the microphone." He hesitated. "Do you really want to be here, after what happened?" She turned to face him fully. "I came back for her," she said simply. "Hill." The girl who stood right there, she pointed to the corner of the stage, and thought her worth ended when the applause stopped. Julian nodded slowly. "I'm not here to win," she added. "I'm here to free the part of me that never played again after that night." The night of the performance arrived with pomp and pressure. Vienna's elite packed the concert hall. Music dignitaries from across Europe filled the first rows. Cameras were stationed at every angle. When Julian's name was announced, there was polite applause. Then, silence. He walked on stage with his shoulders back and his palms open, just like Liana had taught him. And when he played, something extraordinary happened. He didn't mimic her. He became himself. His version of the Liszt transcription was bold and young and imperfect in all the right ways. It breathed with courage, not caution. When he struck the final note, the room exhaled. And the applause that followed was not polite, it was thunderous. Backstage, Julian stumbled into Liana's arms. "I did it," he gasped. "I didn't break." "No," she whispered, "you became." When her name was called next, it felt surreal. Not as a competitor, not as a curiosity, but as a master returning by choice. She stepped onto the stage of Vienna's Grand Hall, no longer needing its approval. This time she played not to prove but to release. Her fingers touched the keys. The same Liszt transcription. But she played it not like a warrior reclaiming a throne. She played it like someone setting a memory free. Each phrase was a thank you to the girl who survived. Each chord, a farewell to the pain. And when she reached the final movement, she allowed herself to look up. The chandelier above hadn't changed, but her reflection in the glossy black of the Steinway had. She no longer saw a fallen prodigy. She saw a teacher, a builder, A woman who came back not to relive the past, but to rescue what was lost within it. As the final notes faded, the audience rose again, some clapping, some crying. But this time, Liana bowed not to them, she bowed to herself. 3 hours after her performance, Liana Cortés stood alone on the balcony of Vienna's Grand Hall, staring down at the moonlit square below. Behind her, the celebration still raged. Music elites clinking champagne glasses, critics scribbling revised opinions, professors whispering her name like it had never vanished. But Liana wasn't there for praise. She had already heard the only applause she needed, her own heart beating steadily in her chest. She had faced the stage that once devoured her and left whole. "Why did you really come back?" The question came from Julian, who had quietly joined her on the balcony, the top button of his shirt undone, fingers still twitching from adrenaline. "I told you," Liana replied. "I came back for her." He raised an eyebrow. "The girl I used to be?" She continued. "The one who walked off this stage 5 years ago thinking she had nothing left. I didn't come to show them I'm stronger now. I came to tell her she never needed to be ashamed." Julian looked out over the plaza. "You think she heard you?" Liana smiled gently. "I think. She was playing with me tonight." The next morning, the competition's results were posted on the hall's brass bulletin board. Julian didn't win first place. He didn't need to. He placed second, but received the highest praise from the master jury for original interpretation and emotional depth. Sora May, the young violinist Liana had brought, received a special mentorship grant after her soul-stirring rendition of Saint-Saëns' Introduction and Rondo Capriccioso. Both of them had walked into Vienna with no fame and no favors, and both walked out with futures rewritten. Later that afternoon, Liana met privately with the competition director, a rigid man in a pressed tuxedo who had once critiqued her collapse as a cautionary tale in pressure management. Now, he was all smiles and courtesies. "Miss Cortés," he said, "your students are impressive. You've clearly found a second calling." "I didn't find it," Liana replied. "It found me when I stopped chasing what I lost." He cleared his throat. "We'd be honored to offer you a permanent role here as artistic director. Master teacher, residency, any title you want, frankly." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thank you, but I've already accepted a title that matters to me." He blinked. "And what title is that?" "Mentor." Back in Boston, Langston Academy was already abuzz with her return. Word had spread about the Vienna performance. The conservatory's email server crashed from press inquiries. But Liana returned not with a celebrity's ego, but a teacher's clarity. She walked back through those doors not for the applause, but for the quiet knock at her office. 1 week later, a shy student named Anaya entered her studio, clutching a well-worn music notebook. "I don't think I belong here," she whispered. "No one listens to me when I play." Liana gestured to the piano. "Then let's give them something they can't ignore." She wasn't there to take back her place. She was there to give them one. To the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the assistants of the world who had more music in their hands than those with titles ever knew. Because sometimes the best way to confront the past is to become the teacher you once needed most. The lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and in the center of Langston Academy's great hall, Liana Cortés stood before a packed room of donors, faculty, alumni, and wide-eyed students. But this time, there was no Steinway waiting for her. There were 3, and none of them were hers. Behind her, seated at those pianos, were the first recipients of the First Voices initiative, Langston's newly launched mentorship program led entirely by Liana. A program for overlooked, underestimated, and uninvited talent. It was the final night of the semester, and Liana wasn't the star. She was the bridge. "I won't be performing tonight," she said, her voice echoing warmly across the hall. A surprised murmur rippled through the crowd. Instead, Liana gestured to the 3 students behind her, Julian Ford at center, Sora May at right, and Anaya Chen, a painfully shy freshman who had only begun playing piano seriously 6 months ago, at left. "They will." She stepped aside, not down. Just aside. Julian went first, playing a reimagined version of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, infused with a subtle jazz undercurrent and impossible to forget. It wasn't a rebellion against tradition, it was a conversation with it. The audience was stunned. Then came Sora, her bow slicing through the silence with Saint-Saëns once again, but this time with more vulnerability, less calculation. A weeping melody that didn't ask for approval, it told a truth. And finally, Anaya. She trembled walking to the bench, but Liana was there, waiting just off stage, her hand over her heart. Anaya played Chopin's Prelude in E minor, not perfectly, but achingly, raw and real. And when she finished, the room stayed silent for a long, long moment, moved not by mastery, but by meaning. Then applause, loud, honest, earned. Backstage, the students erupted with joy, hugging, half laughing, half crying. Liana stood apart, watching with pride. Dr. Evelyn Crane approached her, quieter than usual. She extended a hand. "Miss Cortés," she said, "I want to thank you. I was wrong. About many things." Liana shook her hand without anger. "We all have blind spots," she said. "What matters is what we do when we start to see." That night, Liana stayed late in her studio. The concert posters had been taken down. The headlines about her comeback were already starting to fade from the public eye. But a new nameplate was waiting on her desk. Liana Cortés, founder, First Voices Initiative, Langston Academy for the Arts. She smiled at it, not for the title, but for what it represented. She had once believed the greatest performance of her life had happened on stage, but she knew better now. It was happening in classrooms, in practice rooms. In the quiet moments when a student picked up a piece of music they once thought was impossible, and tried anyway. She wrote a note and taped it to her door. "It's not my stage anymore. It's yours now. Play bravely." It was snowing the morning Liana Cortés received the letter. It came in an envelope sealed with gold. No fanfare, no press. Just her name, no titles, no mention of past concerts or conservatories. Just Liana. She opened it at her desk, sunlight catching the fine print as fresh snow blanketed the Langston courtyard outside. "Congratulations, the Langston Board of Trustees has unanimously approved your proposal to expand the First Voices Initiative into a national mentorship program. Your students have inspired others. You have changed the future of music." Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from joy. She turned to the window. Across the quad, Julian Ford was guiding a younger student through a Mozart sonata. Sora May had just accepted a spot in Juilliard's honors program. And Anaya? She was in Studio 4, composing her first original piece, something Liana never dared to do at that age. The sound of possibility now filled every hallway of Langston. And it all started with a woman nobody noticed, who once just handed out programs. That afternoon, Langston Academy hosted its winter convocation. Faculty and students gathered in the grand recital hall, dressed in black and silver. A massive banner hung above the stage. "One note can change everything." Dr. Evelyn Crane took the podium first. She spoke, not as gatekeeper, but as someone who had been unflinchingly humbled. "We used to teach music as a hierarchy," she admitted. "Now we teach it as a language, and every voice matters." Then she turned toward Liana, seated among the students. And that shift began with one woman. Liana was called forward, not to perform, not to judge, but to speak. She stepped onto the same stage where her students now played with confidence. She looked out over the crowd and began. "I used to think talent was the thing that got you into the room," she said. "Then I learned that assumptions often decide who gets to speak once they're there." She paused. "I wasn't always called professor, or maestro, or anything with respect, really. I was the girl behind the curtain, the woman with the clipboard, the assistant who was told not to overstep. But talent doesn't need a title, and brilliance doesn't always announce itself." The room fell completely still. She smiled. "Remember this," she said. "The most extraordinary people often appear the most ordinary at first glance. And the moment you choose to see them, truly see them, you change everything." As she stepped down from the stage, every student in the room rose to their feet, not out of tradition, out of love, out of recognition, out of truth. That evening, as dusk fell and candles glowed along the corridor walls, Liana returned to her studio one last time before the break. On her piano sat a small envelope, unsigned. Inside it read, "You didn't just return to music, you returned us to it too." She sat at the bench, not to rehearse, not to prove, just to play, for herself. For the young woman who once walked away from Vienna. For the student in every classroom who doesn't speak because no one listens. For every soul who thought quiet meant smallness. The music drifted into the hallway. Soft, steady, strong. Because Liana Cortés didn't just rebuild her career, she rebuilt the stage for everyone else. She was never looking for the spotlight. She was never trying to prove them wrong. But when they forced a forgotten woman to take the stage, she didn't just play. She rewrote the future of music. Because real power doesn't come from applause, it comes from standing up when no one believes you belong. And in that moment, Liana Cortés didn't reclaim her past, she unlocked the greatness in others. The assistant they all ignored, she became the voice they could never silence again.